Dr. Salim Ali, how did it all begin? What sparked off this lifetime obsession you have with birds?
Well, I think I can't for the interest that started it. But I know that when we were small, about 7 or 8 years old, we used to live in Khetwadi in a large family. And now and again we used to have a good many partridges and quails for eating. Because in those days you could buy them freely and they were sold freely in the markets. And the man used to bring them to our house in round baskets covered with burlap. And before they were slaughtered, there was a nephew of mine who was about my own age. We had formed a partnership of pet keeping. And we used to, on the sly, pinch some of the partridges and quails and keep them as pets in a specially constructed pen of wire netting and packing cases. And we used to sit and watch their behavior and habits and feeding and so on. And this is how the interest grew. And when we were rather more flush with money, as after a birthday party or something, we used to go to the Crawford market and buy some better birds, that is to say, maybe spur fowl or jungle fowl and so on. And that is how we built up a little collection there. And we used to sit and watch and enjoy the fun.
This was when you were around 7 years of age, you say?
7 or 8.
7 or 8. But as a boy of 7 or 8, this interest that was germinated, as you say, with the acquisition of spur fowl and partridges.
Yes.
How did this further develop into the actual study that you have now somehow channeled your life into?
Well, then at the same time, I had an air gun. And like all naughty boys, I used to shoot quite a lot of sparrows and so on, but they were mostly round our house in Bombay. And in our school holidays, we used to go to Chembur, which was really quite a jungle and very difficult to reach because there were no communications then. You had to go either by horse carriage or by bullock cart or something. And to get our supply of milk and eggs and so on, we small boys had to go to a village, which is Devnar, and go from hut to hut and collect the eggs that their chickens had laid and bring them back. At the same time, in that village, there were lots of hay, which was put up on trees after the rice harvest. They got the hay and they put it up on trees in enormous stacks to prevent the cattle from eating it. And in those stacks, a lot of sparrows used to come and roost at night. So I waited there with the air gun, and as they came along, we shot them. And most of them were house sparrows. And one sparrow I shot looked rather different, and it was certainly not the house sparrow. And I didn't know what it was because we used to halal them and then put it and then roast them and eat them. So, but this one was a different bird. And as you know, that among Muslims there are certain birds that are to be eaten and certain not to be eaten. If you eat those, you go straight to hell. So we were we were taught that this is not the thing to do to eat those forbidden birds. So I didn't halal that sparrow. I took it home to show it to my uncle to find out whether it was within lawful meat or not. And he looked at it and he said, well, this is certainly different from the house sparrow, but I can't tell you. But he was one of the earlier, one of the founder members almost of the Bombay Natural History Society. So he gave me a letter to the secretary and he said, you go to him and he will help you to identify this bird. So I took the sparrow and the letter to the society, It was a long journey from Chembur to Bombay. There was somebody going in a thing, so I accompanied him, and I got to Bombay and I went to the society, and I was very frightened of Englishmen at that time because we had heard such wonderful stories about their behavior with Indians and all that. So I was very diffident to face a full-grown Englishman. But then I timidly went up the stairs and through that tangle of skins lying on the ground and tigers' heads on the walls and so on, we got up to the secretary's office. And I got to the secretary, Mr. Millard, who was one of the earliest secretaries. And I gave him the letter, and so he was so surprised that a small Indian boy should be so interested as to want to know what sparrow this is, because his experience was that there was very few grown-up Indians who were at all interested in these things. And when a small boy went in, he was very astonished, and he took a great deal of trouble over the sparrow. He took me round the society's rooms and collections and opened up cabinet after cabinet and got the sparrow, which was a yellow-throated sparrow. And he showed me the skins in the collection and compared it with the bird I had brought, and I found that it was the same bird. And he said, if you have an air gun, why don't you shoot other birds of different kinds? And you bring them here, I will identify them for you, and I will have you trained how to skin the bird and preserve it and put the proper labels on and so on. And you can make a small collection of that, and I will give you whatever books there are about them and so on. So I was very delighted, and I never knew that Englishmen could be human.
So it was Millard's initial encouragement, as you might put it.
Yes, I think initially that started off. And in those days there were no illustrated bird books. There were some books which were just writing, and at the most there were the line drawings and so on, which really don't mean very much to a beginner unless he can see a colored illustration. You have to have more than usual interest to read through all that. So he gave me what books they had and asked me to come again and take some more and so on. And that is how I got encouraged. I made a small collection, and from that time I have been very closely connected with the society.
That, as you said, was when you were a very small boy. There must have been other ambitions, there must have been other plans and other dreams you had. Most young people seem to want to...
No, at that time, hunting was all the fashion. Every young man of any importance or so on hunted, and that was the great thing. And so it was my ambition to become a big game hunter when I grew up, a zoologist and a big game hunter.
Remarkable. Did your family share your enthusiasm from the very beginning for this obvious interest?
In the beginning, there was great encouragement, but when it developed into a little more serious thing, and they felt that I was neglecting my school lessons and going in for bird chasing and bird watching and collecting eggs and so on, then they were not at all amused.
Well, there's a connection.
Yes, it was only my brother, one of my elder brothers, who was in the ICS, and he was the one who encouraged me. And he said, this is a very good thing, you go on with this, and I mean, not neglect your studies, but you keep on. And he got for me all the skinning equipment and whatever I needed for the work, unbeknown to the rest of the family.
There seems to be a very definite connection between what you say now and what we know about Darwin. I understand that when Darwin was a little boy, he was severely reprimanded by his family for similar interests.
I think that's a human characteristic, especially of parents.
Yes, sir. Your education, you say that your interest began to get in the way of your studies. What was it that you were studying, say, at around the time you were to go to college? I believe you.
Well, I started off in a girls' school known by the wonderful name of Zanana Bible Medical Mission Girls' School. You know, then later on they changed the name to Queen Mary's High School for girls, which is there. That was the school I went to with two of my sisters. And at that time I was about 6 or so. And then that school was meant only for girls. So when I grew up to about 8 or so, then I ceased to be a girl. And I was taken off and sent to St. Xavier's after that.
I see. Dr. Salim Ali, your education after you'd done with St. Xavier's here in Bombay, you had also moved with your family to Burma. This was.
Yes, well, this is another story. You see, when I finished my matric, I went to the college with the idea of taking up zoology. But at that time, there was no BSc at that time. There was BA honors, and you could take zoology. And to get to the zoology stage, which is 2 years later after the first year, you had to do all these mathematics. You had the curriculum which included mathematics and algebra and logarithms and so on, which I couldn't manage at all. And I was simply sick of college, and I said, well, if this is the only way in which you can get to the zoology course, then I better give up zoology and take to something else, because I can't manage this. Just at that time, one of my elder brothers, who was in Burma doing wolfram mining, he wrote to my uncle. He said, I am very short-handed here. If Salim is not very keen on continuing his studies, I would like to have him here because he will be a great help, and I want some help. So I jumped at the idea to get away from mathematics and so on. And I went to Burma, and I was helping him with the mining, and we had some other business of machinery and mining tools and so on. So, but it gave me a lot of opportunities for going about in the jungles, and that is really where my serious bird study started.
Yes, that was also a time when the world was going through quite a lot of turmoil. As I understand it, your passage from India to Burma was not without incident.
Yes, that was the time of the First World War. You know, this wolfram is a mineral that you get tungsten from for
Yes.
making steel, high-speed steel for guns and so on, which was in great demand at that time because the First World War was on. And to get to Rangoon, you had to cross the Bay of Bengal. And at that time, there was a German cruiser playing havoc in the. It had a very sort of gallant captain who would take off the passengers from those ships and then blow them up. There was great sympathy for the Germans at that time because
blow
of
the
his,
ship up.
Yes, because of his chivalrous behavior. But that ship, you never knew where it was because those were not the days of wireless telegraphy before that came. So that you didn't really get any proper news of where the ship was doing. But we heard such fantastic tales of the ship bombarding Madras and then bombarding Calcutta or bombarding some other part, all at the same time, that it just kept you wondering what is this. And so this crossing from Calcutta to Rangoon was quite exciting. You never knew what you were running into.
Eventful. And then your stay in Rangoon, as you said, was it sort of consolidated this interest that you had because of all the.
In Rangoon, I didn't stay in Rangoon. I had just to. We got to Rangoon from Calcutta, and then I had to go down to Tavoy. Tavoy is in Tenasserim in South Burma.
Here you had the opportunity to go out into the jungles
Yes,
and
it was
observe.
Quite in the jungle, away from any habitation. I was there for 3 years, and then I said that I have had no sort of training in business and so on. I'm just sort of pitchforked into it. I know nothing about the theory and so on. So my brother agreed that I should come to Bombay and take a course in commerce at Davos College. And at that same time, Father Blatter persuaded me to take up zoology because he said you will never get anywhere with ornithology unless you have a scientific background of zoology. So I went through the course of zoology at that time. I didn't sit for the examination because I had no idea that I would be having this as my profession later on. We were doing quite well in business in Burma and we never bothered. And that is why I feel that every young man who aspires to a job anywhere, he must get a university degree for whatever it is worth. He must have these letters behind his name, otherwise he will have the same fate as myself, that we never get a job. Wherever you went, they said, oh, you haven't got a degree, what will you be able to do?
When you returned to Bombay from Burma, and when Father Blatter further directed this interest and channeled your interest from ornithology into the scientific discipline of zoology,
Ah.
your contact then with the Bombay Natural History Society must have become more cemented from your past.
Yes, quite so, especially because the curator of the Bombay Natural History Society, Mr. Prater, who was a great friend of mine, he was also being given this course by Father Blatter. So we used to go together there and attend the zoology lectures. And I remember how when we had to do practicals, and we had to do that in pairs, pairs work together, and when we had to dissect a cockroach, I always gave the privilege to Prater to do it. So it was a great convenience. After we finished that 1 year's course, then I went back to Burma. But I went back during that time, I got engaged and married. And then I took my wife with me to Burma.
I see. And on your return, you and your wife, how did you support yourself? Ornithology?
On the return, very doubtful how I supported me. We had a little income from investments and so on, but it was hardly enough to settle down in Bombay. And my wife got a job as secretary of the Women's Council. And I was taken on by a firm of some cousins as a sort of charitable gesture, and because I had had some training in commerce and business also, but they didn't really want anybody, but they took me on, but there were no prospects there, and I was all the time looking out for something in natural history or zoology in which I had my interest, and I had none in business.
When was it that you first came into contact with Dr. Stresemann?
That was after I got a job as guide lecturer in natural history at the Prince of Wales Museum and Natural History Society through Father Blatter, who was also on the committee, and he was on the selection committee for a candidate for this post, newly created. I was a guide lecturer at the museum. I used to take out students and classes and teachers and so on, as we are doing now, more or less. But then after 2 years or so, I got fed up with this, and I said I get back to serious ornithology now. So I tried to get some training in India. I wrote to all the universities and so on, but there was not a single institution or university which catered for ornithology as such. Only this general zoology, the dissection of pigeons and so on, that is all they learnt about ornithology. Then I wrote to the British Museum and I wrote to the Berlin Museum. In the British Museum, at that time, it's political things, so the British Museum people were not very encouraging to an Indian. But Berlin Museum, the director was Stresemann, who is a very well-known ornithologist. And he was most cordial. He said, yes, you come along, we will do everything possible. And that is really what they did when I got there. They went all out to give me the training that I needed. And I was there for about 9 months. And after that, I had taken study leave from the Natural History Society. And when I got back, the first news I got was that my job had been axed because the government of Bombay at that time, they said, well, they had financial stringency and they couldn't afford to. So I was again without a job.
So you returned to India,
Yes.
faced with the prospect of no job,
Huh.
with a wife to support.
Yes. Well, luckily the wife had a job, which supported me really more than for the time being. And this little job that I had from these cousins and so on. So then tried everywhere. There was a vacancy in the Indian Museum in Calcutta of an ornithologist. So I thought, well, this is a wonderful opportunity, and I applied. But then, with all the recommendations of Stresemann and Blatter and the society as such, they said, you have no degree, so you can't. So I was very frustrated and disappointed at that time. But now I think that is the best thing that could have happened to me. Because some of the contemporaries and some of the person who got the job and so on, they have retired and they have become sort of limpets and mushrooms, and I find myself still interested and going on.
And anything but a limpet and a mushroom.
Yes, but so that's what I now realize, that was the most fortunate turn in my life, that I didn't get that job. And then Stresemann had particularly stressed this point, which has been very well reviewed of many of my papers, that this ecological angle that is given to these studies. Otherwise, people used to go and collect birds and bring back hundreds of birds which were taxonomically studied and nothing more about them. But I am particularly interested in the living bird, how it lives, where it lives, why it lives there, what it eats, and what is the breeding biology, and so on. And my reports are mostly those. So they were very well reviewed in various scientific journals, that this is a new line that has been started in India, and this is what should be the model of the work.
Was there at this point internationally other precedents? I mean, there must, in other countries of the world, the study of bird behavior, the ecology of birds, their importance.
It was more developed than in India. Practically nothing was done. But even in Western countries, it had more or less just begun. And they had advanced a little more than us, but still.
At this point now, as we see it, you came in touch with Dr. Stresemann, who had changed your perspective perhaps from the taxonomy and the morphology of birds more into their breeding habits. This meant field work.
And zoogeography.
And zoogeography.
Geographical distribution and all the sort of ecological aspects of bird study. And I think the Stresemann, up to the end, he kept up with me, and all my difficulties I conveyed to him, and he was very helpful right up to the end. I called him my guru.
Dr. Salim Ali, the study of bird habits and the ecology of birds necessitates a considerable amount of field travel. You were then a young man with a young wife. How did this reconciliation take place?
This was my great good fortune that my wife had the same tastes as I had. She had been educated all her life in England. Her parents went and settled there, and from the age of 5 to the age of 17, when they came back, she had been all the education in England, And when my sisters cunningly contrived that I should meet her and so on, I was very doubtful. As I said, my life will be all in the jungles and so on, and she is a town-bred girl, and how will she fit into this? And of course, she'd been used to much better living than I could afford, and perhaps I thought it would not be. But when I met her and talked to her, and I found that she had the same tastes as I had. She was fed up of the social life in cities and so on, and she said she would be very happy to be in the jungle and be spared from all these sort of activities that social ladies have in towns. So, and that is why she stood up with all this bullock cart travel and walking for miles through the jungle and so on. And this is how we used to move about. Not like nowadays you get into a car or a jeep and you go everywhere and you just... So that gave us plenty of time to do the work thoroughly, not just go there and back again. And we lived for weeks together in the jungle, and sometimes in a village house, sometimes in a broken down cattle shed, and so on. I must say I admire her for all that, and then appeared to be enjoying it. I hope she was enjoying it, but
I'm certain she would have enjoyed it. Being with you for us, in any case,
Well,
Dr. Salim Ali, is something that we all enjoy. But tell me, would she invariably travel with you to all your field assignments during the period, or was
quite often, but not always. When it was very strenuous, I didn't take her along. But
was there no danger then? I mean, surely those were days when there was not as much control in terms of law and order and policing of the
I
interiors
think
of the
there
country.
was far more control than we have now. You look at this Mangal Sutra snatching and so on. We never used to hear anything of that type. It was really quite safe from dacoits and these antisocial people, and altogether it was much safer.
Did she also play any part in helping you with field observations? Two people would always...
Not with field observation so much, but for all my secretarial work, yes, I used to sit back and...
Your uncle, when your father died, you were very, very young, just a baby. Your
Right.
uncle encouraged you, as I understand it, throughout.
Yes, he was a great shikari. He was a great hunter. But I don't think he knew very much about... I mean, he was a regular hunting companion to Maharajas and Nawabs and so on. So I don't think he ever knew any jungle lore or had arranged any of these shikar trips on his own and so on. But he was very keen, and he encouraged us a great deal too.
He looked after most of your family during your formative years.
His wife was really a most remarkable woman, to put up cheerfully with an adopted family of... At that time, at no time were there less than 5 of us, of my family. And not only that, but they had the children of all kinds of friends and so on who were away from Bombay and who had to be going to school and all that. So we were all together about 7 or 8 children in that same place, same time. And this lady was really a very remarkable person.
You were in Berlin in 1929 with Dr. Stresemann for 7 months. And then when you returned to India, where did your study of birds take you? How did your interest in the study of birds or your actual life proceed from there?
Well, when I got back, the first news that I got was that my job had been axed because the government of Bombay had no money to keep it going. So I was wondering what I should do, because after having studied all that, the technique of taxonomy and so on, I didn't want just to go back to selling dalda or nails or coir rope or whatever it is. So, as there were no jobs going, I asked the society to write to the various states. Had been very little worked, and lot of work had to be done there. So the society wrote to the states, and the advantage then was that most of these states had British senior ICS people as administrators. And they were all members of the society, and they were very keen on natural history. So the society asked them if they would provide the funds for carrying on the bird surveys of the thing, that I would be working without any salary, but if that grant would just cover the expenses of the thing, then the society would lend me one of their taxidermists, and then I could do some
Conduct
work.
the surveys.
So that is how it started. First of all, it started with the Hyderabad state, and a 6 months survey was done there, and a report was published, and I think it had a good effect, and other states also afterwards followed quite readily. Next one was Travancore, then Cochin, then I don't remember the order, but it covered the whole of central India, and Mysore, and part of the eastern Ghats, and part of what is now Madhya Pradesh, and Bahawalpur, and Gujarat and Kutch. So that most of the areas that were blank were covered. So now we have a comprehensive account of all the ornithology of those places.
Yes, what was the composition of these surveys? What was the prime objective, and how did you overcome the obstacles that you must then have faced in the process
Well, the thing was that just at that time, this business of trinomials, that is to say, the definition of subspecies. You know that species are also divided geographically according to, there are some small differences, but they have to be recorded.
Yes.
Because to study evolution, you have to have even minor differences on record, then you can. So although we knew what birds, what species are likely to occur, we didn't know how the subspecies was found in that area. What are the differences, for instance, in northern birds and southern birds and western birds and eastern birds and so on. So that was very necessary. And that were the collections that we made at that time. They are the basis of the determination of subspecies.
I see. At this stage, you were still talking mainly about the taxonomy and the morphology of these birds. The surveys did not take into account in those days things like their food habits and what they would eat and how they would interact with other species.
Yes, well, my particular interest was that. I mean, this was an excuse, this subspecies business, because otherwise I would never get a chance unless you brought back some specimens and so on and let the museum people worry about them. But I myself really was much more interested in the ecology of the birds and the habitats and why they lived in particular habitats, what was the particular attraction for them, some special food, you know, the sort of phenology.
Yes.
Where you sort of connect up the vegetation and the flowering times and the fruiting times and the nesting times of the birds and so on, and you try to get a sort of jigsaw puzzle. You fit in all these things and you get much more fun out of that than just looking at dead skins.
Yes, I'm sure. And at this, during the course of these surveys, considering as how there was so little work done in these areas previously, would you remember any species that you might consider these surveys responsible for discovering, species or subspecies for that matter? Were there many such birds that perhaps nobody knew the existence
Yes,
of?
quite a number of subspecies were described. By the man who coordinated with me by doing the taxonomical work while I did the ecological work was Hugh Whistler. He was a very good friend of mine, and he was a good taxonomist. And he had retired from India and settled down in England. And then he couldn't get any chances of doing field work, so he was working on the museum collections. And this thing, again and again, in the reviews of my reports and my things, everybody was very appreciative of this, that some sort of ecological work was done. Because in the olden days, there was just, you stuffed a skin and you sent it to the museum and they identified it, and more or less that was that. But nobody bothered about the living bird.
Yes, and these were trying days. At this point in time in the history of this country, traveling into the kind of places that you had gone to, it must have been fairly difficult. The infrastructure must have been almost non-existent. You had to go to places where there was...
Yes, and there were no facilities really, unless you created them yourself. Travel by bullock carts and by foot or by camels or whatever you got to get on the...
Did many people accompany you on your field trips?
Usually I had those two taxidermists from the society and my wife Tehmina, who, the curious thing about it is that she took so kindly to this kind of life. Although she was quite unused to it, she went with her family to England when she was 5, and she had all her education there, and the life there was entirely different to anything approaching this. And that she should have taken so well to this sort of life was a great thing.
Yes,
and that is how I really could do something. Achha, then apart from her, we had a servant who was a sort of, who cooked and who looked after us. But as I said, such servants are not born nowadays. That's a past generation, that's gone. The amount of trouble he took and so on, it's really wonderful. That if we got to a place at midnight, he would insist on cooking something. He said, no, you can't go to sleep without eating something. And he would open up all the utensils and light a fire and cook something or the other, and then he would be wonderful.
Yes, at the end of a hard day, I can imagine the atmosphere
Yes.
must have been quite congenial to...
Yes.
Must have been wonderful.
Yes.